The Colder War, how the global energy trade slipped from America's grasp. That's where we're going now, the global struggle for energy dominance and what it means for investors and consumers. The Bloomberg Advantage, brought to you by Veridesk, the height-adjustable standing desk that sits on your existing desk. It comes fully assembled and raises from a seated to standing position in seconds. Learn more at varidesk.com. Very happy to welcome to the show Marin Katusa. He is the author of the book. He is also a successful multi-year investor in the commodities industry. For example, by age 30, Marin had built one of Canada's largest copper mines from the ground up. He's involved in shale oil production, uranium extraction, and so much more. Eminently qualified to talk about this topic. Welcome to the show.
My pleasure.
So first of all, just give us a little bit more about your background, because it's one thing to write about the energy market, and you don't have to be in it to write well, but your experience, tell us about your work of your life.
Sure. I run a hedge fund that's one of the largest hedge funds in Western Canada, investing directly in resource sector. We've outperformed the index by over 600%. I'm also probably the largest investor in the fund. So my money's on the line, hence why I have a different perspective than what I call the talking heads in the sector. And, like you mentioned, Copper Mountain, you bring modern technology to past producing resource fields, whether it's shale, resources, uranium, copper, gold, and it's about enhancing production. And
a lot of people that were in the industry would have, scoffed at that, right? Because they didn't think that there was more to get out of the ground in many cases.
It's a tough thing to sell because the guys who make the decisions are generally older and new technologies they don't understand. It's not proven. For example, we were the first to shoot Titan-24. It's a Jeep geophysics. It's never been done before, but we proved it up. And the key is to have a great team. Everything in investing, you have to have success, is investing in people. And it's not just me who did it. We have a great team at the Copper Mountain, at Quadrilla. It was a great team of people.
But also absolute persistence and faith, right?
Especially during the crisis of 08, 09, to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. It was a tough go.
You have written this book. Your parents, we were talking before we started this conversation live, from Yugoslavia originally.
Yes.
So you're from Eastern Europe, very close to Russia. And the title of this book, The Colder War. When it comes to energy, what is the Colder War?
Well, essentially, Russia, under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, has reestablished itself as a global superpower. And the difference between the Cold War, which ended with America taking global superpower, and the Colder War is countries like China didn't really matter during the first Cold War. Now, under Putin's leadership, countries like China are working together in concert against America's interests. And I've traveled to over 100 countries. We've done investments around the world. And you really see that if you get away from the Western media.
Why pick on Putin and Russia in particular, though? Because there's huge oil-dominant countries. Venezuela, for example, and other Latin American countries. So why are you so? One of your chapters is the Putinization of oil, the Putinization of gas, the Putinization of uranium. Is it really that much of a dominant?
Oh,
figure?
Definitely. A lot of people don't realize that Russia has been the number 1 or 2 oil producer in the world the last 100 years. 25% of the world's natural gas is in Russia's control. Almost half of the world's uranium is within Russia's control. In fact, 1 in every 10 homes in America is powered by Russian-controlled uranium sources.
So how did Vladimir Putin go from, he was in St. Petersburg, ex-KGB, we were supposed to have a peace dividend, this was, the Soviet Union broke up, to become what he is now, a leader who is, rattling his saber, not just at Ukraine, but certainly using his oil weapon to rattle it at Europe too.
The right man at the right place. I call him the Slavic warrior. If you understand the mindset of the Slavic people, he controlled his inner circle. And the first thing he did was control Russia by taking over the oligarchs, and we go into great detail there. Famous one is Kovarorsky, how he took that over. And then he went, and at the time, if you look at the Rose Revolution and then the Orange Revolution, he didn't take on the Western interests. But now he's established themselves, and look, they've got over $400 billion in reserve currency. They're buying gold. He's established himself. And you look over the track record, Russia is actually growth rate is greater than their death rate. It's the first time since 1992. You look at their standard of living's increased, their poverty levels decreased. You look at their rankings globally for education is increased. It's higher than in America. So you look at the major deals that Putin's done now with China and Iran. He's really established and growing the influence of Russia around the world.
The idea that sanctions will curb this, there's US sanctions and European Union sanctions now too, will it?
Well, unfortunately, in the long run, it won't. In the near term, sure, we've seen the ruble decrease, its currencies significantly take an impact. But you have to remember, what does Russia produce? They produce oil that the rest of the world. So they actually make a higher margin on their returns because they sell cheaper to the world. So if you look at what's going on with Saudi Arabia, or even, OPEC is at war with the U.S. shales, Russia is going to not just survive, but they're going to increase their market share.
Well, but if oil prices keep dropping, then even Russian companies won't want to produce, right?
Actually, the Russians can produce oil much cheaper. What's cheaper.
Their break even? What's the bottom of?
From a company standpoint, you're looking, the Russians can produce and make a good margin at about $35 to $40 per hour.
So they've still got a big margin.
Definitely.
But what about his tax revenues? The economy is, they've had a huge inflation now. This has hit the economy already.
Oh, definitely. But the key is he's establishing where you look at someone like Germany that makes up 25% of Gazprom's revenue. That's not changed. They're still importing major gas.
Now, you devote an entire chapter of your book, The Colder War, How the Global Energy Trade Slipped from America's Grasp, to Ukraine. What does Vladimir Putin really want in Ukraine? Why go to all this bother?
Three things. I spent a lot of time in Ukraine, and it comes down to number one, the offshore oil and gas deposits, the deep sea port, and the third and most important thing is the South Stream natural gas pipeline. Half of the exports that Russia exports natural gas to Europe goes through Ukraine. They want to get away from that. And what they really care about is the South and the West. And if you look at what's going on, Germany, if you look at countries, Finland, 100% of their natural gas comes from Russia. They're increasing their imports. And at the same time, Russia's now, if you look at the largest oil and natural gas fields in Russia that have been discovered in the last 30 years, all that oil and natural gas is going to China. So now he's solidifying his European control and Asia.
The subtitle of your book, How the Global Energy Trade Slipped from America's Grasp, is it too late to sort of bend over and pick it up again?
No, and that's the key where we really focus in on the book. If America continues with the leader in the next election that follows Obama's failed foreign policy, it's going to be very ugly, and America will even get worse in the colder war. Unfortunately, if America does pick a leader who goes against Putin in the colder war, there's a great chance because America has one advantage: technology.
All right, we're speaking with Marin Katusa. Marin Katusa is the author of The Colder War, How the Global Energy Trade Slipped from America's Grasp. And there's an example of what Marin was just talking about in Louisiana at the moment. The Louisiana election runoff coming to Capitol Hill with Republicans and Democrats scheduling votes on the Keystone XL pipeline, each party trying to clinch the last undecided Senate seat. We'll ask Marin about this and more next. We're having an absolutely fascinating conversation with Marin Katusa. He's the author of a book called The Colder War, How the Global Energy Trade Slipped from America's Grasp. He's also a Canadian hedge fund manager and one of the more successful founders of copper companies and energy companies in the world. He is the number 3 publicly traded copper company in Canada and is also involved with Lord John Brown of BP fame with his interests off the coast of the UK, right?
Yeah, the Bolan Shales, a company called Quadrilla, which is the most successful shale gas company in Europe.
And you also have been all around the Middle East,
Definitely.
Involved in deals, and you've been shot at and so forth. But let's return to this book, The Colder War, How the Global Energy Trade Slipped from America's Grasp. You say we need leaders that will ensure America's stronghold in energy. But you also say that this belief that America is going to be self-sufficient when it comes to energy is wrong.
Correct. EIA came out with a report, and the media loves these sound bites. And even in the report, the 380-page report, which I went through and wrote the 12 errors in the report, they never said it was going to become energy independent. They said almost energy independent. And that's the key. So, for example, everyone's talking about the Keystone XL pipeline right now. America has a choice to make. either stick with the Venezuelan heavy oil or take the Canadian heavy oil. The reality is the refineries in America switched over and need heavy oil to blend with the light oil. So it's America's choice.
What about the role of the Middle East, particularly right now, Saudi Arabia? You just said that Russian companies can probably still produce and even make profit at $30, $35 a barrel on crude. What role is Saudi Arabia playing right now? What's their game?
Well, the key was America used to be the largest importer of Saudi oil. That has changed. The largest importer of Saudi oil is China now. And in 2009, when OPEC pulled back the production, that increased Russian oil market share. OPEC does not want that today. Also, OPEC is at war with the U.S. shale sector because the U.S. shale sector has been so successful, they plan on exporting refined NGLs, natural gas liquids, and condensates. That eats into OPEC and especially Saudi Arabia's market share. So not only is Saudi Arabia at a oil war with Russia, it's also at an oil war with America.
The twilight of the petrodollar, that's one of the chapters towards the end of your book, The Colder War. The twilight, why? Well,
Judgment Day for the petrodollar is here, and it's going to happen sooner than later. For example, you look at the major deal that Russia signed with China. In U.S. equivalent dollars, it's going to be well over $400 billion to start with, and it's going to exceed $1 trillion. It's the world's largest construction project on the planet. You look at the deal that Russia has just signed with Iran for 8 nuclear reactors. All of these deals are happening in non-U.S. dollar. That's going to decrease the demand for the U.S. dollar. And so, it's a growing trend, not a decreasing trend.
So you're saying, do you think that weakens the dollar? Right now, we've got a strong dollar vis-a-vis Europe, and I guess one of the aspects of that weaker dollar, good for U.S. exporters, particularly manufacturers, but it makes it a little bit tougher to buy your oil from overseas.
Well, most importantly is if they're going to be exporting it, because you're producing in U.S. dollars, it's going to be more expensive for the U.S. producers to compete with Saudi Arabia and the Russian weaker ruble.
So I suppose your argument, given that you're Canadian, would be that Keystone should go ahead, or at least a similar type of pipeline.
Well, the key for people to remember with pipelines is across North America, 15% of the pipelines that we depend on were built before 1960. So it's actually a bigger threat to not develop new pipelines and depend more on rail, which is very dangerous, which has increased by 16-fold over the last 6 years, and old infrastructure. So it has to happen, and it will happen.
What if we get better and safer at rail? Then we wouldn't need the pipelines so much, right?
Well, unfortunately, the pipelines, you look at the way that containers are set up, the shale oil is much more flammable than regular oil, and it's much more dangerous. So even with safer rail, the risk is still high.
You know, just a few years ago, all the big books, all the big, oil story was peak oil, we're running out. What is your view? Where is the price of oil going to be in a year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years?
In the near term, what we've been saying for a couple of years, you're going to see a lot of pressure on the downside for oil because of this oil war going on. But in the long run, you look at, for example, there's 7 straits in the world for seaborne oil, the Strait of Malacca and the Strait of Hormuz. 2/3 of the world's seaborne oil goes through those 2 straits. That's over 25 million barrels a day that goes through these straits. That's high risk. So in the long run, oil's going much higher. In the near term, we're going to have probably down to about $60 to $65 oil pressure.
Where is the next biggest discovery going to come, off the coast of the UK or Venezuela?
Well, the UK's had great success with the Bolan shales. That's over 100 TCFs of gas. But I think what people have to look at is what's going on in Africa. No one's really talking about the East Rift in Africa. You look at companies like Africa Oil, the largest oil discovery in the world in the last 10 years. And also Europe. Western Europe has a lot of potential if they bring modern technology.
Thank you so much, Marin Katusa. Great conversation, great book. Marin told us earlier that his book is just about ready to break into the bestseller list on Amazon. Get it while you can. The Colder War, How the Global Energy Trade Slipped from America's Grasp.